Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that had a super Saturday, staying indoors. And how was your Saturday, Rob? How was being indoors? Any change from the previous weeks?
Yeah, no, my weekend inside was interesting. I replaced a windowsill with my DIY skills, which I'm not exactly known for, but the window is still in. It's still in place. No water has come in, so I'm quite pleased with that. I did venture outside for a little bit. I had to go to a DIY store and wore a mask and was, maybe frustratingly in my opinion, the only person wearing a mask in there. But that's fine. I'm cool with it.
Yeah. I think that's the thing I would echo. Masks have not been made mandatory outside of public transport, but if you're in an enclosed space, there's loads of evidence showing that they help. And I think my concern is often that especially younger people maybe are not wearing them because they're less concerned about the disease and that it can affect older people more drastically, and therefore it's kind of being a good citizen. You should be wearing a mask, in my opinion.
Yeah, exactly. I always feel that it's like this mask is. I always feel like when I'm wearing a mask, it's for other people's protection, not my own. I don't, you don't want to go out there, and I think people look at, there's a stigma behind masks, particularly in the Western world, as you're seeing in America, where a lot of states have made them mandated. There seems to be a bit of a backlash online, or at least in the little bubble that I'm in online. There's lots of videos of Karens, inverted question marks there, I'm doing around the mics, going into like Walmarts and refusing to wear masks and kicking up a big fuss.
There's a brilliant, again, I know we refer to John Oliver a lot on this show, but there's a brilliant clip from, I think it was California, of people coming to a town hall and being like, I will never wear a mask because of my freedom. And it's like, we're just asking you to wear you don't go around saying, oh, well, I won't wear underwear because of my freedom. I'm sure there's at least one person who's done that. The average person realizes that kind of argument is just not okay.
Like I said, a little bit frustrating going out there saying I was the only one, but hey, I'm going to continue to be a good citizen, continue to wear my mask, and look forward to my haircut on Friday, which I've suddenly realised I'm looking like Stig of the Dump at the moment with my hair's going out of control. So that would be, at least my wife will be happier that I'll look fairly presentable for when I go out and see nobody again.
I'm tempted to go along and just see what happens because I feel there are people who probably need a haircut more urgently than I do, seeing as working in a hospital but not being frontline person. I'm very unlikely to be going into the hospital soon, so it's not like it matters how long my hair gets, so might as well give it a go. It's got to the naturally curly stage, which is a thing that happens with Wilkinson hair, so we'll see how that goes.
That's awesome. I think you could pull off a full Brian David Gilbert, BDG.
Oh, yes.
Full swoop.
Yeah.
That would be a great look. But anyway, so that was my weekend. How was yours? Did you go to a pub?
Well, so yes, technically, and I know at least one of our listeners has a running joke with me about going to the pub. I went to the pub because I was. Well, basically, we're next to two pubs. One is slightly nearer, and we heard a lot of people on Saturday being quite leery, and we're like, and then on Sunday, I was like, you know what, I fancy a drink, but I don't really want to go sit on the pub on my own. That would be weird, and also I imagine it's very, very busy. The pub I went to is quite a nice pub. It's kind of a foodie pub, and from what I saw, as I briefly went inside to collect my pre-ordered takeaway beer, looked perfectly fine. People were social distancing. It was going well. And basically the takeaway menu has been expanded. I asked when I was in there, because unfortunately they only do cask ale if you turn up, because you have to pick it up in a milk jug. They don't deliver that. But they now do their food and their cans and stuff via Deliveroo. And basically, as far as I'm concerned, I'm very happy. That they're a good pub. I want to support them. But I'm very happy being able to get takeaway beer because, you get it at a slightly better rate. Obviously, I appreciate if everyone went to takeaway, then the pub probably couldn't support itself. But right now, I think I feel a bit safer going and getting takeaway beer just to have at home. Their cider's pretty good as well, so they do some. I mean, they haven't got it at the moment, but they tend to have lilies. So I know you're a fan of that one. So yeah.
Yes. Well, speak to my wife about that one. She's the one who can actually stomach the stuff. I love it, but as with all ciders, I consider it apple juice until suddenly my body doesn't, and then it's very upset with me.
But yeah, no, a good weekend all round. So we're going to move on into the headlines now. So our first one was from the Express. Boris, don't be reckless on Super Saturday.
Yeah, this is kind of what we've been talking about already, the slow and gradual reopening of England. Not Scotland or Wales, they're slightly behind because there's different staggering of rules, but on England this Saturday, pubs opened for the first time, as well as hairdressers, and it sort of signified the first easing of the lockdown, or things going back to more of a new normal. And I was about to discuss from the last element, you talk about, people feeling more comfortable to go outside, but not go indoors and do certain things. It's that big question of how far do we turn the dial towards, more freedom, of more doing what we used to do, but also keeping a respectable social distance and being responsible for the health of others. I think that was brought into light by, the opening of the pubs was the big thing everybody was sort of concerned about. There had been polling taken by YouGov, which you can see in the show notes, about how people would react to this Super Sunday. And they asked people, would they be going to the pub on the day that they were open? In fact, only about 9% of people said they would go on the day they'd reopen. That was the same for the same week. And then some people were saying, about 22% I've got here on the figures said, yeah, they'll go sometime in July, but not in the first week. And the majority of people, about 49% there, saying that they'll go later in the year. And I think that kind of shows, it kind of reflects what we've been saying now, is that, yeah, sure, the pubs are open and we've been told that it's safe to go, but I don't necessarily feel I should jump back there instantly when the potential effects it could have if everybody was to suddenly swarm the pubs.
Yeah, and I think there's kind of a split, right? There's the people who are kind of like, oh, it's not a concern. And I mean, my anecdotal evidence, I've definitely seen groups of people gathering before we were really allowed to gather in any significant numbers, breaking social distancing. And with the best will in the world, if people get a bit drunk, they're going to forget. That's the main concern here. But I mean, like, that's what I mean. The groups I have seen on my brief forays outside who've been not socially distancing tend to be groups who have had a bit of alcohol. So you can see why people would be concerned. I think the thing that maybe I wasn't considered is that we were scared to stay inside because we were told to by the government. And I think there's an ongoing effect of that because people are a bit reticent to just immediately go outside. And yes, there are some people who are acting like everything's normal, but I would say, I mean, a lot of people I've discussed it with are like, oh, is it safe? Is the government, like, there's a bit of mistrust in the government, meaning that just because, the newspapers are all like, oh, it's Super Saturday, it's our Independence Day, and other rhetoric like this, that I think the average person can see through that and say, maybe I'll give it a miss this week. I've not been to the pub for 3 months. What will another week hurt? That kind of thing. So it'll be interesting to see how the numbers change over time, how it gradually comes back.
Yeah, precisely. Going back to some of your points about how you said drunk people don't tend to social distance, that was the exact words of the police constable the day after on Sunday, and there were pictures coming out from Soho, I believe, that showed that it was just the street was packed, nobody could move. It looked like a normal Friday night before lockdown. So there are certain places that it's odd, isn't it? I think it's weird just seeing pictures with that many people in it at such a close distance and thinking, oh my goodness, that's happening now. We've had the same when you've seen those pictures on the beaches, for example. Everybody outside, it's just like, that seems like a hotbed for it's a hotbed for disease, and it's weird that you're having that reaction to those pictures, but it does seem there's a great cognitive dissonance now between seeing what's going on in my little bubble and people are out there in the world doing that. It just seems, I
think it's interesting as well, because obviously for people who are shielding or so on, it's very different to people who don't have to and feel like they may have been kept at home when it was unnecessary, regardless of whether that is or isn't the case. Like, people may feel that way, but there's also the fact that, like, we're pretty certain that outside is not so bad. It's the being inside in enclosed spaces, and it's also, I mean, I'd have to go check now, but the last study I saw on this was saying that like the chance of getting the virus is of like 15 minutes of being close to someone. So that walking past someone outside a shop queuing is not really a problem. But obviously we've kind of started to pick up this kind of ingrained, and I don't know if there's a bit of Britishness tied in with this as well, where you already want to avoid someone when walking down a path, and you've got your mask on, like it's obviously rude to just pull up your mask as you walk straight towards someone, but if you're going like into the town centre or something, you may feel a need to kind of keep a bit more of a distance than you would have before, and I think there's kind of the social thing, it will all kind of come out in the wash in the end, but it is just a bit odd right now. Like there's a lot of, everyone is taking it a bit differently. But when it comes to pubs and stuff specifically, there was on the coronavirus podcast, which is what used to be Brexitcast, they had someone on who represents one of the kind of like landlord unions or landlord interest groups, and was saying that, yeah, you see these pictures, and I think it's that story we've had again, like when we were talking about the protests and other things, where from taken from afar, a picture can easily be framed to make something look like there's a lot of people together, or there may be like one street where things are particularly bad. But is that the picture overall? I mean, I would definitely say from my brief foray outside on Sunday, that the pubs were quite empty. Like it wasn't, there wasn't this kind of release that everyone was expecting of suddenly everyone descends on the pub. I think people are being a bit slow to, just come back to normal. I think people are rightfully a bit worried that we're coming back too early and so on. And that is affecting people's behaviour.
Yeah, it's a big question about, I think this kind of does boil down, as you mentioned earlier, to trust in the government and what people feel about that. And in particular, we've seen from polling, it's not just, my reckon, we've seen in YouGov polling that there's a majority of people now disapprove of the way the government has handled the coronavirus crisis at the moment. And that might feed in some of their skepticism about when the government says it's okay, if it's really okay to go out and do that. And, they think the sensible solution is just to hang back a couple of weeks. I also think it hasn't helped, particularly in the last 2 weeks, because once again, Boris Johnson has had quite a bad week in particular.
Yeah, I mean, so we've got a list of things here, and it's always bad for a politician when there's a list of negative things as opposed to like the one story. So do we want to start with his interview on LBC, which will touch back into our discussions we've had previously about Black Lives Matter and all of that?
Yeah, let's go ahead with that. So the first one, he had an interview on LBC with Nick Ferrari, I imagine, who is one of the right-wing commentators. So you'd expect maybe that, although he's a journalist and has, he's trying to grill Boris Johnson, he might not be, he might throw a few softballs his way to try and make sure that Boris Johnson comes out of it looking okay. But anyway, he did ask Boris Johnson about taking the knee. Now, I can't remember if we discussed it last time about Dominic Raab's response to this. So that was Nick Ferrari's jumping off point. He said, look, Dominic Raab said he wouldn't take the knee. Prime Minister, would you? To which Boris gave about 30 seconds of his usual waffle before proclaiming that he wouldn't, and he respects everybody's choice to, but the reason he wouldn't do it is because he doesn't believe in gestures, which raised a few eyebrows, in particular thinking about all the Boris gestures he's done in the past, the zip line thing with the two union flags. Even that night, he was going to light a candle in remembrance of the NHS workers who'd lost their lives and attend a celebration of the NHS reaching, I think, 72 years of it being, in service. It just seemed like you couldn't quite put those two things together. To say Boris Johnson doesn't believe in gestures when he's been doing so many of them at the moment, led a lot of people to answer, hey, well, what were we all clapping for on those nights where we were clapping for the NHS? Should we not done of that because we don't believe in gestures? The
phrase "he can't catch a break" is the wrong one, but he is constantly tying himself in these kind of knots, isn't he? Where he's essentially not criticizing himself. Well, I mean, in some ways, but it's not Trump criticizes Trump, but this is him saying things because he has this strategy of waffle that we've touched on before, where it's very easy for him to say things that may sound good as a soundbite on their own, but when you take that with the broader context of other stuff he's done and other stuff he's said, you're just like, well, you're either criticizing yourself or being deeply hypocritical. And nowadays it's very easy with all these transcripts and everything just to pull it up and say, well, you said this last week. Yeah,
but Boris has always been at risk of contradicting himself, and there are lots of things that you can drag up from Boris Johnson's past to have a go at Prime Minister Boris. But the problem now, I feel, is that he's contradicting himself every other day. We've talked about it with U-turns in the past. That's another thing that just makes him seem not on top of things, not on top of the detail or remembering what he's last said. And it's made all the more high profile now he's Prime Minister. He can't get away with any of that stuff like he may have been able to do in the past. So, yeah, I think that bit was embarrassing and didn't show, we've talked about last time about Raab's comments. It's frustrating that those people in power don't seem to grasp the significance of, the taking the knee. And I think a lot of people have, in my opinion, taken it the wrong way. There seems to be a stream of thought amongst those on the right that taking a knee is sort of a sign of submission or subjugation, and that you're showing, your deference to another race. When actually a lot of people are saying no, that if you look at the origins of, why it was first done by Colin Kaepernick, it was done out of respect, a different type of respect than lots of people wanted, when you're meant to stand for the flag and salute. But he took the knee because he knew that was historically a sign of respect, but it was just his way of making a protest. So, that's the one thing.
Yes, so next up, still with LBC, he was criticised about his dad going on not a jolly, but I believe the line was that his dad went to Greece because they have a property there, and so he was there on business. But obviously, at the time when most of the British public have been A, at home for 100 and odd days at this point, and B, aren't sure whether they can book a holiday, etc., or what's going to go on with their summer plans, and schools are starting to finish, it kind of came at a very bad time from that point of view as well, from the optics of the whole situation.
Yeah, it came, I think Boris Johnson's dad, Stanley Johnson, Greece isn't on the list of places you can fly to directly from the UK, so he actually had to fly from the UK to Bulgaria and then fly from Bulgaria into Greece to find the loophole to get there in the first place. And again, it reinforced this mantra that's been happening throughout the lockdown, that it's one rule for them and another rule for the rest of us. That was the slogan that was put forward with Dominic Cummings and his trip to Barnard Castle, and that was the one that was reinforced by Labour. And this was yet another example of this happening with a high-profile, even though it wasn't a Conservative MP, Boris Johnson's dad, who has been in the limelight and is a known celebrity for appearing on things such as Gogglebox and I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. He's another public figure who is undoubtedly attached to Boris Johnson, has supported his son a lot throughout the recent days and appears on television defending him. To have this happen so openly is obviously very embarrassing for Johnson indeed. And when asked for it to comment in this interview, Boris said that he didn't like to speak on family matters and tried to brush it all away. It was another example of them. How the Dominic Cummings situation, if you ask any minister of the government now, they will just say, that situation is closed, which is kind of like another way of just saying, I'm not talking about it, la, 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 fingers in my ears, can't tell me about it because it's all closed. Boris Johnson was trying to do that very quickly with this story by saying he doesn't talk about family. Ironically, the next question from Nick was about how Boris Johnson's new son was doing, and Boris was more than happy to answer that question. So, again, another contradiction within about 30 seconds there, which may be another new record for Boris Johnson.
I mean, next he'll be contradicting himself mid-sentence, but we'll keep our eyes peeled for that one. So then the other bad moment for Boris in the last week, talking about care homes and saying that the care homes didn't follow the procedures, despite the fact that care homes weren't told to lock down until, please correct me if I'm wrong here, but my understanding is we as people went into lockdown before the care homes were given any actual advice.
Yes, that sounds about right. And one particular reason why the care homes were so badly hit, or one of the theories behind it, is that as hospitals were emptied to try and make sure that they could take a influx of COVID patients that were expected, they inadvertently sent patients from hospitals who already picked up COVID in some way, shape or form and put them into care homes where you have a lot of people who are incredibly vulnerable. So the last thing Boris Johnson should be doing in that situation is criticising the actions of care homes who were literally just following the rules set by government at that time. You can also say the government was liable in many other ways. We know that the NHS was struggling to procure PPE at that time. Even more so were care homes, but care homes were kind of seen as a second-class citizen in that, right? The PPE was going to go to the frontline workers first, then it was going to go to care homes. The fact that it didn't may have actually, one of the theories is that may have, increased the spread in care homes because they simply didn't have the materials to protect themselves or the residents. So for Boris to say something like that, saying too many care homes didn't really follow the procedures, seems to shift the blame onto the care homes and not onto the government. And this has caused quite a big backlash, particularly from one of the big care home charities who called Boris Johnson's comments cowardly this morning in a BBC Radio 4 interview. The government has been asked to apologise, and they haven't. They've kind of said that Boris Johnson's comments were misconstrued and that he wasn't putting the blame on care homes. He was trying to say that care homes didn't really follow the procedures because the procedures didn't exist yet, because we didn't know all the properties of COVID very early on in those days. We didn't know about how many people were asymptomatic or how quickly or easily it could spread. But still, I think that's a pretty weak response on the whole, and essentially writes a Labour attack ad in the future and will certainly be brought up by Keir Starmer in Prime Minister's Questions tomorrow. It's just another, I think, embarrassing own goal for Boris Johnson, something that didn't need to be said. I don't know why you would pick on care homes in that way. And even if what the government is saying is true, that his comments have been misconstrued, he is the Prime Minister and should speak clearly on these issues. You shouldn't misconstrue the Prime Minister to think that he is blaming care homes for any of the effects of coronavirus and what happened there. The fact that it's even been mentioned in this way it shows a failure of communication, I think, on Boris Johnson's part.
All in all, not his best moment, although I feel like that's every other week at the moment. So relatedly, we've been seeing PMQs now with Keir Starmer, who is definitely pressing the point more against Boris, and obviously that's coming up tomorrow as we record. How do you think that's going for Boris? Because obviously if he's so we've talked about the idea that Keir Starmer, being a lawyer, is obviously very well versed in these kind of, drawing out someone's argument and getting them to kind of stumble over themselves and try and explain themselves. What is your impression of how Boris has been faring there? So
I think Boris has changed up his tactics a little bit in order to try and combat Keir, but it's made Prime Minister's Questions become a little bit of a predictable slog for me at the moment. Sorry, I found the lockdown as a good excuse to go and watch Prime Minister's Questions during my lunch break, something that I maybe would have avoided previously, and I think it acts as a really good example of the check and balance on power we have in this country. The fact that you can ask questions directly to the Prime Minister and see what he says certainly gives you an air of transparency about where the government is going. And we've talked about Boris Johnson's various U-turns that he's had to do via Prime Minister's Questions, which again shows what a valuable tool they are, even if they shouldn't be there for announcing policy. Boris Johnson has used them in this way to try and justify his actions or justify a U-turn to make a certain decision. Prime Minister's Questions now has really highlighted to me how much Boris Johnson hates being questioned and criticised, and he hates being put under scrutiny. And it's really clear that Keir Starmer is getting under his skin in that way. But Boris Johnson's line of attack back is always saying, look, Labour, you said you'd support us reopening the economy, which needs to be done, and reopening schools, which needs to be done. Why don't you get behind us and support us? You're kind of being unpatriotic here. Come on, guys, help us out. To which I think is the wrong way to approach Prime Minister's Questions. It's meant to be scrutiny of the government. You're meant to expect an opposition to your ideas. If you're not there if you're there, complaining that the opposition is opposing you, then what are you doing being, what are you doing being Prime Minister? I don't know if that's harsh, but, what do you expect? Keir Starmer is always going to try and not pick holes. I think he's always there to scrutinise your policy making. And that's what Keir has tried to make clear in his question. I believe he said it all before when Boris Johnson has turned around and said, you're not supporting us. He says, I do support the easing of the lockdown. However, I think it's right to question some elements and see if they are backed up by scientific evidence in order to release those locks and make sure that it's safe for everybody to go back. We shouldn't just take your word as gospel. I just think it's divulging into that pattern where the rhetoric is kind of going around in a circle and nobody's getting anywhere, I think, because the two men are stuck in their arguments. But I would again encourage people to go and watch it, because I believe that is where you get to see some of the real best bits and worst bits of the Prime Minister. He's very good when given a soft question from the Conservative bench in which he's able to rally the troops and everybody goes rah, rah, rah. But I always feel that when he's put under pressure from the other side of the House, he either A, attacks with too much venom back at them, which makes him seem a little bit, I don't know, like very sensitive to criticism, or maybe most worryingly of all, he seems to be not across the detail or lacking the facts to come back at them. There have been numerous occasions now where the Speaker or somebody involved, or even Keir Starmer, has said, you said something in this House last week. I have evidence from the Office of National Statistics that says otherwise. Or even sometimes Keir has said, that figure you've just called poppycock was on the slide briefing from your previous television appearance last night, which I think instantly makes Boris Johnson look like he's not across all of the detail. And that's the impression I continue to get through Prime Minister's questions. And yeah, I think in a world where the Johnson government is trying to shield itself as much from media criticism and create its own narrative, Prime Minister's questions is the one narrative that they are really struggling to control. So if you want to see proper scrutiny of the government, that's where I'd go. Wednesdays, 12 o'clock, be there and be square.
The other thing, I think people often, if you just see sound bites, I mean, Boris, I think, has been around long enough and in the news long enough and on TV long enough that people know what Boris sounds like. But especially when you have the opposition there, you might just see a single soundbite from Keir on BBC News, unless there's some big thing happening. Whereas this is a good opportunity to actually see how that person acts there in opposition. And that's one of the many reasons why PMQs is great, and I'm glad we have it. So moving on from that, I think we've spent quite a while on headlines. There are more headlines coming out now, but we need to move on to our main story tonight. So this is an interesting one because it kind of harks back to some stuff we've talked about before, and also kind of some general kind of British politics ideas that may be more interesting to our international listeners, but I think it's fun to dive into as well just for British listeners. And that's the idea of the government versus the civil service, which obviously we can draw upon the excellent documentaries Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister during this discussion.
They're always brought up. Literally, they are taught in my A-level politics class as an example of how the civil service works. But yeah, we'll come on to that. The main reason I've brought it up is that this news may have slipped under the radar to most people, and I think it's one of the elements of this whole coronavirus crisis that the government is actually getting on with a lot of its programme in the background and what it was elected to do government for. So we've seen in the last week, like the House voted to end freedom of movement, for example. That was passed, and I think if we were in normal times, that would have been bigger headlines. But another headline that sort of passed us by and only really made a splash in political circles was the fact that the head civil servant, Mark Sedwill, said that he was to step down from his post in September. This is significant because, there had been allegations that there were rows between him and the government, particularly Johnson and his special advisors, most notably Dominic Cummings, who is well known for his dislike of the civil service and what it does. So I thought I'd go on and say, well, Dominic Cummings dislikes the civil service. Tom, why do you think somebody like Dominic Cummings would dislike the civil service in one way, shape or form.
So the simple answer here is that they don't do what he tells them to. But I think, that is the point of the civil service. And there is always this tension in any organisation, whatever it is, of tradition, doing things via a process versus changing things quickly. And so when the group you want is voted in and they get into government and they're like, oh, we're going to make all these changes, and then it feels like they're stymied here and there, stopped from doing what you want, that's often because there's some kind of inbuilt set of process and procedures. It's like, Labour can promise whatever they want when they're in opposition, right? But then they have to deal with the fact that we have to balance the budgets and stuff like that when they come in. There are concerns like that we're aware of. But then below that is also the fact that there are inbuilt structures. And the government versus the civil service is kind of a common one, because basically the idea with the civil servants is they are agnostic politically, and they must at least be seen to be in public spaces. Obviously, it's not true that civil servants have no political bias, because every individual has their own political biases. But the idea is that they are the people who are trained in the job of getting stuff done within Parliament and moving all these things, preparing white papers, things like that. And people make a career of that. That's their full-time job. And it used to be a very, I don't know now, I do know some people in the civil service, but it definitely used to be a very cushy, you've got a brilliant pension, job security for life and stuff like that. And I know during Labour there was definitely some layoffs of civil servants and kind of cuts there because it was seen as being too big and a bit in the way. But I think there's always this push and pull between the government and the current civil service, where the civil service has to be like, no, there's a procedure for this, or no, we can't do that because X. And the government has said, well, we need to deliver this by yesterday and we can't. And so there's always that push and pull. But I get the feeling that it's a bit worse right now just because of the number of high-profile civil servants who are leaving / being pushed, depending on your point of view on the matter.
Yeah, it seems... I think Dominic Cummings has made no secret of the fact that he wants to reform the civil service quite drastically from the inside. So he sees them as like a natural roadblock to the government's agenda, views them as like too comfortable and in their nature that they resist any change. And the big change Dominic Cummings wants to get through is Brexit. And as we've talked about in the past, this brings a massive round of legislative changes that the civil service has to be responsible for. And it is probably Dominic Cummings' impression, I think, fairly or unfairly, that the civil service is full of Remainers. You could say that's probably likely because of the, if you were to look at the demographic breakdown of how the country voted on Brexit, I would argue that most of the civil service is university educated, which was a group that was more inclined to vote Remain. Another reason he might think that is because the civil service would have an awful lot more to do if Brexit went ahead than if it didn't. So they might be a little bit work shy, in his opinion, and trying to avoid, doing all the hard work that Brexit involves. Whatever the matter, Cummings is looking to shake this up by appointing what he sees as his own people into positions of power and making things very uncomfortable for those who've been there a long time. Now, this goes against what a lot of people would say are the core principles of the civil service. As you mentioned previously, the civil service is meant to be apolitical, and the way that Dominic Cummings wants to shake things up is by promoting his friends into places of power. And that seems to go against that very core principle. One of the main examples of this is the person who is now replacing Mark Sedwill in his role on the National Security Council. The person who has been nominated to replace him is David Frost. He is currently a diplomat and the person responsible for negotiating Brexit. He's the man that you'll see opposite Michel Barnier. However, when you have a look into his political history, he's also an ex-special advisor to Boris Johnson, and a lot of people have seen that his promotion is based on loyalty to Boris rather than on merit. Most notably, the most vocal critic so far has been former Prime Minister Theresa May, who had quite a fiery confrontation with Michael Gove in the House of Commons. It's significant for a couple of reasons, this. The fact that a former Prime Minister speaks out against a current sitting one is usually pretty rare. the fact that the Theresa May uses her limited time that she has in the House of Commons to address this pretty much signifies how important it is to her as an issue of, national security. Theresa May said in her own speech to the Commons, said that during her time as Prime Minister, she had listened to the expert and independent advice from national security advisors, and then asked Michael Gove, why is the new national security advisor a political appointee with no proven expertise in national security? She's really driving to the core of the issue there, saying that I want experts and I want independent advice. The person you are delivering is neither an expert in this field, nor is he independent, because we know that he's been a special advisor for you in the past. And that puts a real question mark about, again, how this government is acting. I've criticised the cabinet for saying that they appear to be people promoted on loyalty rather than their ability as cabinet ministers, and that may have not played into our hands during the coronavirus outbreak. To continue making that mistake when it comes to maybe issues of national security this time does seem a little bit short-sighted, in my opinion. And it's one of those big issues where you would argue for the independence of the civil service. One of the reasons it is independent and free from political influence is so that you get the best people in those positions. Because really, you want the best. You don't care if they voted Remain or are Labour and you're a Conservative government. As long as you've got the person giving you the right advice to make the decisions, that's all that should matter when it comes to, government affairs. And to see the current Conservative government ignoring that is a worry, even to those within their own party. At the end of this article, you have another, not a Prime Minister here, but a former leader of the Conservative Party and Foreign Secretary. You had William Hague saying that Mr. Frost's appointment had raised eyebrows and possibly sharpened daggers within defence and intelligence communities, essentially saying that this was a decision that wasn't popular on the backbenches and won't be popular within the institutions the government hopes to get on side. So, all in all, a decision that has certainly ruffled a few feathers, and although it might be another short-term victory for Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings and getting their man into a position of power, in the long term, I believe it might prove to be more detrimental for them trying to reform the civil service, because they'll certainly see a lot more pushback between not those within the civil service, but also from those within their own party as well.
If this continues and there's further politicisation of the civil service, like a long term, I mean, I don't just mean over the next few months, but, if there's kind of a consistent changing of how the civil service is run, what does that mean long term? Because we definitely don't have, like this is one of our big checks and balances, right? But it's not formal in the way that checks and balances may be in other countries.
Yeah, totally. I think the best example we've got where you've lost that check and balance is where in the US, where the president essentially has a lot of control over not only who's in his cabinet, but the civil service around him, who runs that White House wing. And all of those appointments are very political. They serve the president, and they make sure that their agenda is carried out no matter what. That often means that you get a president who is able to pursue their agenda quite robustly and not have people talk back. But at the same time, if you want to compare it to, somebody like Trump, Trump's cabinet and maybe appointments in the White House have been tumultuous, to say the least. You've seen a lot of comings and goings and people who are arguably not up to the job but have been put there because they are extremely loyal to Trump's vision, as it was in 2016 or how it changed going into 2018, etc., etc. So there is a real worry that if you continue down this path, you lose a very important check and balance, and this might be mean, but you lose the adult in the room, perhaps. There is, going back to when you were talking about comparing the civil service and the yes minister model at the start, Sir Humphrey was very much the adult in that room telling the minister, no, you can't do this, and this is the reason why. It's because you haven't been around as long as me and you don't understand the things you have to do, the other politics within the politics beside it. If they just become
yes men and they're allowed to do whatever they want, you lose that important scrutiny and you might get ultimately very silly decisions being made that are not in the best interests of the country in the long term. So that's the real worry if we carry on down this path.
Yeah, I mean, I think we do compare across to the US in quite a few of our discussions. And it is interesting because, I mean, the US is set up with these various checks and balances that are supposed to work. And then, as you say, this kind of erosion, this politicization over time has caused that system to be in the situation now where you have, but basically it's just whoever's in charge gets things done. We essentially have a two-party system here as well. And the problem comes from say you're a Conservative voter and you get the Conservatives in, and the Conservatives can't do the thing they want to do because the civil service is like, no, we've got a way of doing this. You have to follow the procedure. Or then, you as a politician for the Conservatives are in the situation where you have to turn around and say, well, I'm sorry, we thought we could do this. We can't do this because X, Y, Z. Or it will take time, and then it doesn't happen by the time you've been voted out. And so it doesn't happen. And you have the same, and then the Labour person comes in and says, I'm going to make all these changes. Same situation happens. But the point is that there are incremental changes happening each time normally. It's just that you can't just turn up and just change everything on a dime, because if the country changed exactly what it did every time we voted in a new government, that would be, could be quite dangerous. And so it is a tricky problem, but I think, in general, politicization of the civil service is not the solution to deal with that frustration. The problem is you can put anyone in the position where when it's against them, they go, oh, actually, yeah, it's reasonable, there's too much power there. But then you have to think, what's the flip side? If the person with the complete opposing views to you gets in and can immediately change how the country works, are you okay with that? And I think if you ask that question, the average person would say, no, actually, I don't trust them. And that's why it's useful to have a buffer of some sort. I definitely think there's a longer conversation, and maybe a summer special when we're talking about doing our silly season specials. We could talk about where we think that line could be, as opposed to what it is currently now. But I definitely think this idea of politicizing the civil service and also this whole thing with special advisors is not the way to go.
No. And I think that's the one reason why this story it certainly blew up on my Twitter, and there were a lot of people saying this is a very significant move, even if the appointment of, his replacement is yet to be decided. It's going to happen in September. It's enough to make ripples now. So it's another one of those stories to just sort of pin and say, come back to another day. The way the government acts in September, that's the thing to really look out for, who they appoint as the next head of the civil service. If it's somebody who's very close to Boris and Dominic Cummings and really wants to reform things, then we might see some significant change in the years to come. They've got 4 years left, this government. They've got a lot of time to try and change the civil service to implement their agenda. So it's just another one of those wait and see things.
So now we have an ad for another show from TTSS Productions. Join Mike and Tom for nerdy conversation with a multitude of guests on Hat of Many Things.
Say hi, guys.
Hi, guys.
Hello.
I'm Mark, a librarian and professional wrestling ring announcer.
I cast League of Legends.
Soteros Philbrucato, best known for my work with White Wolf and Onyx Path Publishing on the World of Darkness.
Hi, I'm Jason Carl. I'm the producer of V5 at White Wolf.
Yeah, my name is Johanna Pettersson, a Finnish game designer.
So, as we've been doing the last few weeks, we're going to go over to the presidential polls in the US to have a look there. So, we have our first poll we want to look at is who is ahead in the national polls. So, I know we discussed this a little bit last time, and we were saying that last time was the first time Biden had kind of made that clear separation where all of his polls were above all of Trump's polls. And it looks like that trend has continued, but the upward trend is not, it's not a meteoric rise, but Biden is now on 51.1% versus Trump's 41.5%. So I think since we last spoke, Trump has essentially plateaued. Trump hasn't gone anywhere really, but Biden has had a little jump. So that just means some of the not sures in the middle have moved to Biden.
It shows that Biden is still polling incredibly strongly across the country. one of the big takeaways I took from the 538 podcast in the past few weeks was that the races in both Texas and Georgia, which are traditionally very Republican states, are looking competitive for Biden. And if that's looking competitive for Biden, then it means Trump is in trouble in a lot of other places throughout the country. Of course, we're in a very odd situation. We are how many months away from the election now? Happens in November. I got this wrong last time, but
that's 4 and a bit months away, because I don't know exactly when it falls in November. It's end of November, right?
Yeah, it's usually the first Thursday in November. I think they vote. I think it's early in November. Yeah, you'd be getting into a time where you'd start to be getting wall-to-wall presidential election coverage now, particularly in the US. I remember back to 2015, and it certainly seemed that the coverage had ramped up. Obviously, worldwide events have pushed that to one side for the moment, but it appears people are focusing on far different things, particularly Trump's handling of Corona, which hasn't seemed to have improved any. In particular, I think since we last spoke, there is quite a spike happening in the US, particularly in red states, in Trump-supporting states, which again isn't helping his numbers or the way that his supporters would be, considering how the crisis has affected them. Since our last podcast as well, we've had Trump's comments in the 4th of July speech, where he's gone on to sort of like defend statues, and I think maybe kind of put his platform across for how he's going to fight this election by saying that he was going to drive out the radical left. This might be where the election of Biden rather than Bernie Sanders plays into the Democrats' hands, because I think it's very easy as a Democrat to say, oh, we're not the extreme left. We didn't vote Bernie in. You know, no matter what you can argue if Bernie Sanders is in fact extreme left, and I do think that Trump is using hyperbole there. But I think the Democrats do have some genuine dissonance between them and Sanders to say, look, you're not voting in an extreme left person, you're voting in a moderate. Remember me, I was Barack Obama's best friend. He's going to use that a lot during this campaign. But in particular, the fact that he has seen more of a moderate may play into their hands if Trump tries to use that kind of tactic. I can't remember if I said it last time, so apologies if I'm repeating myself, but Trump is again coming. There's a lot of 60-40 issues in the country, and Trump is coming down on the 40% side rather than the 60% side, again and again and again. And that's why you're seeing his polling numbers like they are, with more people gravitating towards Biden because they disagree with more of the culture wars and the decisions that Trump is making while in power. So certainly, I think at this poll, this is still hopeful. As we said, Biden hasn't increased his lead since we last spoke, but he's on 51.1% and has a lead of 9.6%. That's still quite a large lead. You have to start getting nervous if that number gets down to about 6 or 5%. That's the tipping point where Trump would, even though he would still lose the popular vote, may still have a path to victory through the Electoral College and the way that he's able to talk to certain swing states, particularly in the Midwest, the ones that won him the election last time around. So there's a lot of way to go. I always say this with these sort of polls. There's definitely, 4 months is a very long time in politics, and I think, although we'd usually be getting the election cycle coming up now, we're not long off it. When we're going to be 2 months away, 1 month away, we are still going to see that we're going to have presidential debates in one way, shape, or form, even if they won't be the traditional packed town halls. We are going to see more rallies, even if they aren't going to be as populated as Trump wants them. So there's still a lot of things that can happen on this campaign trail.
I mean, the things that can sway people near an election can be, a bad night at a debate. It can be, they're both fairly older gentlemen. One of them could have a health scare. Either way, things like that are the kind of things that can still completely upset things. And with 4 months out, predicting is a fool's game still, I think. But yeah, I mean, it's looking good for Biden right now, but we're going to be revisiting this every 2 weeks.
Yeah, I think the other thing just to say is that Biden hasn't chosen a running mate yet, so that again could sway things. He hasn't got a vice presidential candidate. And there are some people, even in Trump circles, saying that Trump should look to replace Pence as VP with somebody else who may help sway those Republican voters who are wavering. That would be a big move. I can't think of any president in recent history who has changed their VP in between terms without it being forced on them for some health issue or something like that. So, that's the one. No pun intended when I said it. That's the one trump card he might be able to pull to turn the polls around for him. But yeah, as we said, long way to
go. So the other thing I just wanted to briefly touch on was the presidential approval poll, which is just Trump. Do people approve, disapprove? And there are some big disapprove percentages. So these aren't all A-star polls. I will filter by the pollster grade in a second, but if you look at the last few days, there's disapproval at plus 20, which is quite high. So that would be 59% disapprove, 39% approve. So, I mean, that still doesn't seem like his base is coming down too much, but it does definitely seem like those people in the middle are being swayed against Trump. If we filter that to the A+, you're still looking at all of the disapproval ratings are always above 10 difference. And his base doesn't get above about 43% for the last 2 months. So, yeah, Trump still has that base, and because of how the Electoral College works, that could still act in his favour. But it definitely seems like people who are in the middle are veering away from Trump more than they had before. So I think that might be cause for, understanding as well. So thank you as always, Rob, for joining me and for, giving us your insights and filling me in on all this stuff that I am not so well read up on. As always, you can find us in all of the usual places. You can find us at parliamentary.observer. You can find us on Twitter. You can find us on Instagram, Reddit, and on Facebook. You can find those links easily from our website. You can find us on all the podcasting apps, on YouTube. Find us wherever. Come and chat to us. We're more than happy to chat and reply to you. If you come and find us, also give us a like, rate us, all those usual things that help podcasts get discovered. So yeah, I just want to say as well that next time our normal episode slot is going to be a focus on the Indonesian response to coronavirus with our Indonesian correspondents, you may remember from last year. So that should prove to be interesting and a bit of a break from the kind of normal discussions we've been having about British and American politics. So please come and join us for that. And with that, there's nothing further for me to say than it's good night from me.
And it's good night from him. Bye.
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 Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Kat refuses to let us podcast. This is our aside for our listeners to go and subscribe to daily_Dora on Instagram, and you can see Rob's absolutely beautiful cat